what's so great about the Southern Claims Commission documents is the fact that these people who applied were really everyday folks, people who actually ran the gamut in terms of their social status, in terms of their place in the community, their demographics, their race, their sex and education. But a lot of them left us no other written records. So these claims documents preserve the testimony of everyday people living in Lauderdale County of what they experienced throughout the Civil War, right here in our own backyard. Not only what they experienced, but the fact that all of the approved claimants anyway were able to demonstrate the fact that they were Unionists during the Civil War. People who from the first days of the secession crisis on through the darkest and bleakest days of the war, right at the bitter end, were able to hold on to Union sentiment. And that's what makes these so invaluable, so remarkable, is it's not only the experience of everyday people throughout the greatest crisis in the history of our country, but also people who remain loyal to the Union as that was taking place. Now, this, of course, you may remember from last time, has a huge personal significance for me. After college, I started studying my genealogy, and I very quickly came across the Southern Claims file of my fourth great-grandmother, Bethany Gray. And I think I told you some of her story last time, but if I might remind you, Bethany Gray's husband, John, died the 27th of October, 1864, leaving her the widowed mother of 10 children. And John probably could not have picked a less opportune moment to die, because 4 days later, General Hood crossed the Tennessee River with 30,000 Confederates at Florence and began skirmishing with the Federal Army led by first General Croxton and then General Hatch along the line of Shoal Creek. It was arguably the climax of the Civil War in the Shoals in northwest Alabama. And the discovery of her experience through these claims, through the Southern Claims, led me on a journey to research the Civil War in the Shoals and northwest Alabama so that I could better explain her experience, put it into context. Why did General Hood cross the Tennessee River at Florence in November 1864? What were they doing there? How did it fit into the larger picture of the war at the time? And then also how typical, or shall I say atypical, was Bethany Gray's experience relative to other people from Lauderdale County who filed claims. And so that discovery led me on a journey of research that arguably is the reason why I have the job that I have, the reason why I'm speaking to you today. And I have actually abstracted all 72 approved claimants from Lauderdale County to get all the information I can get out of them. And this presentation is really the result of those 5 or so years of research that I've put into this topic. Now, the presentation today will seek to answer these questions. First of all, what was the Southern Claims Commission, or SCC for short, and why was the commission established? What was the application and approval process? What was it like for people to try and get money from the government for their losses during the war? How was Lauderdale County in context with the rest of the counties of the SCC? So how normal was Lauderdale? How abnormal was Lauderdale? Putting Lauderdale County in its proper perspective. Who were the claimants, and what do their claims have in common? What are the demographics of those claimants? So their race, gender, age, et cetera, et cetera. What do the claims documents tell us about life in Lauderdale County during the war? And then we'll look at some remarkable and, shall I say, scandalous examples that we can find in the claims. And then we'll wrap it up and see what is the significance for the SCC for genealogy research and the heritage of Lauderdale County in general. Now, first we have to understand a little bit of the historical background during the war of why a claims commission had to be set up in the first place. I have a couple of quotations here from these lovely gentlemen. On the top right, that's Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, who marched through this area in the fall of 1863. While he was at Iuka, he gave orders for an expedition to go out, saying, "They will help themselves to corn, meat, and whatever they need, and take all good horses, giving simple receipts, to be settled for at the end of the war, according to circumstances." And then here on the bottom left is subordinate General Dodge, writing from Pulaski later on in the spring of 1864, said, "Forage, provisions, stock, etc., taken from rebels of persons of doubtful loyalty will be certified to and paid for at the close of the war if the holder can prove loyalty at that time." Now, to summarize what they're saying is, we will take it now and pay for it later, simply because the exigencies, the necessities of being a military commander, they didn't have time possibly to sort through who was loyal and who was not before they took their horse or before they took their corn to feed their men. They didn't have time to sort out their loyalty. And frankly, by the end of the war, by 1864-65, it didn't matter anyway who was loyal or not. If you had something to take, they needed it, thank you very much. And getting pay for that was something that would be settled once the war was over. Now, I will also say it's important for us to know, even though these are Union commanders, both sides, both armies, Confederate and Union, foraged liberally off of local populations during the Civil War. So it's not simply a matter of Union commanders. Rebel commanders as well had to take what they can get wherever they could find it. Now, why did the Federal Army have to rely so heavily on citizens in the first place? Well, it's a mixture of things. So first of all, it could be a punitive measure, punishment, in other words, to a community. And a good example of that is Cornyn's raid. You're all dirty rebels down here. This factory's producing socks for the Confederate Army, so we're going to burn the town. Sometimes it was more preventative than punitive. So you'll see often they say, if we don't get it, the rebels will. So there's a stockpile of bacon in this particular community. We need to take it so that it doesn't fund the Confederate war effort. More often, it's the exigencies of combat. So especially cavalry groups were very nimble and fast-moving and could respond to a fluid situation by saying, oh, well, we need to cross the creek right now to get away from a rebel group that's coming up. And in those situations, you cannot wait for your baggage train, which is very slow-moving, to follow you across the creek or wherever. And so if you find yourself on the wrong side of the creek, you need to just take what's available in your neighborhood. Also to know in the 19th century, transportation is extremely cumbersome and limited. They have very long, poor lines of supply, and the further that you get from railroads or rivers especially, it becomes very practically impossible to haul everything that you need along with you as you must move. And so for that reason, they had to rely on the community wherever it is they happen to stop on a line of march. And then also a remoteness from headquarters or supply depots. And so, for example, a place like Nashville, which was held by the Federal Army from the early days of 1862 on through the war, was a reliable supply depot. So they had plenty to eat if they were in and around Nashville. But the further you got, several days' march away from that supply base, the more you had to rely on local populations to make up the shortfall of what you needed to provide food for your men and animals. So even before the close of the war, there was a precedent established that the government owed loyal citizens for property that was officially confiscated by the Army during the war. And throughout the last half of the 1860s, the government was besieged with claims from southern states, mainly from people who had been unquestionably loyal to the Union during the war. And it wasn't until after Northern radicals sort of lost their power in Congress in the beginning days of the Grant administration in around 1870 that finally some steps were taken to officially reward people who were loyal and had losses during the war. And the result of that is the Southern Claims Commission, which was set up by an act of Congress on the 3rd of March, 1871. There were 3 commissioners appointed. The head of the commission was Asa Owen Aldous of Vermont. There was also Orange Ferris of New York, and the one who has the least strange name, James B. Howell of Iowa. And they were all Republicans. I will say this was the Ulysses S. Grant administration at this time. Now, very quickly, these men became overwhelmed with their duties, and special commissioners were set up to answer back to them. Ultimately, though, all claims went through these 3 men and were reported back to the House of Representatives before they were paid for. Now, who was eligible for compensation? Well, first of all, you had to be a U.S. citizen who resided in a state that seceded from the Union. So that would be Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and then also West Virginia, because West Virginia was part of Virginia for a large part of the war. Secondly, critically, you had to be loyal to the Union during the rebellion, and you had to be able to prove that to the government's satisfaction. And thirdly, you had to have property lawfully and officially confiscated for the use of the federal army. Now, those little words carry with them a huge weight because the government was not going to pay if, for example, some soldiers were behaving rather badly one day and decided to break into your house and bust up your furniture or steal your money. They were only going to pay for official, lawful requisitions. And Southern response was overwhelming. Some 22,298 cases were filed by individuals, family groups, churches, and businesses. The total amount of alleged damages claimed was over $60 million in $1870. And then ultimately, though, only a third of those claims were able to withstand the intense, minute, and often absurdly rigid investigation and qualifying test. And that's according to the book that Kitty shared with you, Southern Loyalists in the Civil War. Critically, he says as well, virtually all claims were settled at a drastically reduced amount, meaning that you did not get what you asked for from the government. Now, as soon as Congress passed this legislation, by the end of March 1871, the Huntsville Advocate was printing the act in full in their local newspaper. So at this point, how do you get started asking for money from the government for what they took from you during the war? Well, often in our community especially, the first anyone would have heard of it would have been in the newspaper. So by May 1871 especially, you start to see advertisements in the Florence Times-Journal by local attorneys spelling out the requirements for the Southern Claims Commission, calling people in. And then, of course, after the public notices in the paper, word of mouth would have spread it the rest of the way through the community for that sizable part of the community who did not read or write, especially not newspapers.
Hi, this is Lee Freeman, and you're watching North Alabama Local History. Former Confederates handling cases for Unionists.
We'll point it out, yes. Well, there was a buck to be made, and there was a new regime in town, so they were going to do what they had to do. This was Daniel P. Lewis of the firm Lewis and Fullerton, who handled virtually all claims from Lauderdale County in North Alabama. And then he is actually putting out an ad here, March 24th, 1871, saying that he has all of the rules for the claims and soliciting some business. Now, so great, you decided that you want to try and get money from the government. You're going to come to Florence. You're going to hire an attorney. You see some advertisements here from the time in April 1871. My fourth great-grandmother used the term Keys and McAlexander. Alexander McAlexander, by the way. That one really threw me for a loop whenever I was reading some of these 1870s documents. No, that can't possibly be right. Yes, his name was Alexander McAlexander. The man you see here in the front, Neander H. Rice, he was Justice of the Peace at the time, in addition to many other hats that he wore.
Mayor at the time. Union was mayor at the time.
He wore a lot of different hats in the political community, but he served as Justice of the Peace here in the claim of Henry Dunn, which you'll see over to the left. And a lot of these law offices were located alongside the courthouse at the Court Square, and this is, of course, the courthouse in Lauderdale County at the time. I will say that images from this time are preciously scarce, in addition to images of the claimants. So I've had to be a little bit creative in terms of the photographs that I've chosen to show for you, because otherwise it would just be a lot of documents. And so that got the ball rolling. You hired an attorney, you filled out an initial deposition, and it was a rather arduous process, even in the best of circumstances. This is an example from the claim of John Burrow, which I consider to be a successful petition. He filed his initial paperwork in August 1871. In February 1872, he filed an application to have testimony taken before a special commissioner. So if you were not able to go to Washington, D.C. and testify to the SCC yourself, which virtually nobody was, you had to apply for a special commissioner to come and take your testimony instead, which he filed that application in February 1872. Finally, in August 1873, his testimony was taken before the special commissioner. Now, Mr. Burrow actually had to furnish some supplemental documentation. He had another witness, a very good witness in his case, and his lawyer applied for that witness to give testimony, which he did in June 1875. And finally, in October 1876, over half of a decade later, Mr. Burrow actually finally received payment for his claim. Now, I consider this to be a rather cut and dry application.
That was a quick one.
For example, my fourth great-grandmother, Bethany Gray, did not have such an easy time. She filled out her initial documents, as most of them did, in May 1871. This is her application and power of attorney. She had her testimony taken before the special commissioner in 1874 in July. Her attorney asked for some further investigation to be done because the claim was just sitting inactive in Congress. They didn't act on it. So he asked for her to be investigated by a special agent to try and corroborate her claims. So finally, in June 1877, this man, Richard Avery, came and interviewed her and her neighbors to try and get a sense of how legitimate her claims were against the government. And then finally, in July 1878, she finally received a fraction of what she asked for. The time between her initial filing and her payment was just over 7 years. One thing I'll note here, in her petition from July 1874, she asks the government for just over $2,900, just under $3,000. But in 1875, whenever she's about to be investigated, the claim has jumped to $4,500. Now, the reason for this is, I think, that some people with more cut and dry claims had already had theirs settled by this time, and she had learned through the grapevine that nobody was getting the full amount that they asked for. And so if you thought that the government owed you $1,000, well, ask for $2,000, because you're not going to get the $1,000, but if you ask for $2,000, you might just get it. So she beefed up the claim quite a lot. And rather than seeing that as disingenuous, I think that is rather clever and savvy. Now, whenever everything was said and done and your claim was submitted to Congress, they all have this cover sheet here, which will give a summary of all the property that was claimed by the person, the amount that they claimed, the amount they were allowed, and the amount that was disallowed. In addition, there will be a remarks section where the commissioners of claims will remark on the person's loyalty and the validity of their claim. Now, here again, I must emphasize that almost nobody received the full amount that they asked for. In this example from Caroline Robinson, she claimed $289. They awarded her $131 for her claim. Now, after all of that, after all that rigmarole, the application process, 7 years of depositions and investigations, these are the 72 people from Lauderdale County who successfully navigated those hurdles and received some compensation from the government. Now, the people here on this list run the gamut in terms of their social status, in terms of their level of education, in terms of their age, their race, their sex. People of color are 12 claimants, which is just over 16.7%, and I have their names in bold. Claimants who were women, 9 of them, which is 12.5%. There was one person who was both a woman and a person of color, which was Caroline Robinson. Almost all the women were widows. It was very difficult for a woman to own property in her own right in the 1870s. Mostly it was because she inherited it from her husband. But some of them, like Susan Thrasher and Caroline Robinson, actually were working professionals who had property of their own. Now also, some of these people were veterans of the Union Army. There are at least 4 that I know. That's William Danley, Thomas LaFan, Elias Thrasher, and Walter Stutz. And at least 2 of them as well, Thomas Allington and Henry Hart, were slaveholders. So this shows us that one's political beliefs about secession did not necessarily correlate with their social status vis-a-vis slaveholding. Another thing to note is that claimants often belong to the same network of friends, relation, neighbors, and kin. And you see their names pop up time and again as they testify and give witness in each other's claims. And we'll see in a moment how their regional identity was very much tied up in their kinship and neighbor relations. This is a map that I made whenever I went through and looked for the approved number of claimants throughout every state in the Southern Claims Commission in order to put Lauderdale County in context. By the time I was done with this map, my fingertips were stained green from coloring all the green ones in. But you'll see that Lauderdale County and indeed North Alabama stand out whenever you look at the SCC as a whole. It's actually really comparable to Northern Virginia in terms of approved claimants. Now, I have to say as well, there is some margin for error here. For example, in Fold 3, sometimes people's claims get accidentally put in with other people's claims, and then sometimes people filed multiple claims. Those are rare circumstances, so we can just kind of take this as a representative sample. But so there are 72 claimants in Lauderdale County that were approved. That's the third most of any county in Alabama, after Walker County and Cherokee counties. The average number of approved claimants in Alabama per county was just under 11, so 10.8. So in that sense, Lauderdale County had over almost 7 times more approved claimants than the average number in Alabama. I have to point out as well that this map not only shows the prevalence of unionism in North Alabama, but it also shows the necessity to forage off of local populations. So Lauderdale County found itself basically on the frontier of Union-held Middle Tennessee, and the claims show that it's an intersection between unionism and the kinds of necessities that we talked about earlier.